If you still can't get over 50% on paper 1 question 5 for English language, this is exactly the guide that you need. I've seen it time and time again with my students. They answer the question and they get below 50% and they can't figure out why. It feels like that the exam scheme is rigged. The problem is, that response isn't entirely wrong. The creative writing question doesn't assess how creative you are. It doesn't even assess how good of a writer you are. It actually assesses how well you can follow the guidelines outlined in the mark scheme. It doesn't care whether you write a brilliant piece of description if it doesn't follow these guidelines. So here's exactly how we do it. When you first get the question, you'll be given one choice to narrate and one choice to describe, and this used to be a really hard choice for me when I was doing my GCSEs, until I realised one thing. One question is far harder to do than the other. So you need to know which one to pick. If you pick the narrative, you're almost dooming yourself to fail, and there's a couple of clear reasons why that's the case. A correct narrative is consisted of 17 parts, and you have 50 minutes to write this question. How do you expect to get 17 parts of a narrative done when you barely have time to plan? And the second issue is characterization. This is difficult to do, even for professional writers. So the idea that we can do it in 50 minutes is ludicrous. Overall here, the big issue comes down to the lack of time, so don't pick the narrative question, ever. Always pick the description question. There's no complex structures that you need to use, and you can wrap it up really quickly if you're running out of time. You won't have to go through 9 stages of a narrative and do them all extremely badly simply because you lost your way in time. So when it comes to description, there's 2 key factors that you need to understand before you can even consider how you write the question. The first is that good description comes from showing rather than telling, and the second factor is that you need to utilise description of the senses. And these are 2 things which I do not see enough in students' writing. So when it comes to showing rather than telling, the big thing here is you need to make sure that you're not telling me that a spade is a spade or a bed is a bed. Instead of calling a bed, well, a bed, call it a cloud of comfort or some simile or metaphor related to it. The big thing here is that we all need to know exactly what it is you're talking about without you directly saying it. And this way we can actually get an image in our head, so you utilise the method of imagery, which is one of the things you're required to do in the exam. The next thing you have to do is refer to the 5 senses. This at times can be quite difficult to do, especially with senses like taste. That's quite hard to incorporate into a description, and if that's the case, just ignore it. Don't challenge yourself too much with this. There's no point making the exam harder than it already is. So when it comes to these, you need to include at least 3 different senses per paragraph. This way you can ensure that you're playing with the complex ideas that the exam scheme requires you to. As I mentioned earlier, the examiners are looking for certain key things. They're not necessarily looking for you to be able to write well. So in terms of some of the things that they're looking for, they're looking for you to make use of sophisticated vocabulary. Now, what that actually is, the mark scheme doesn't correctly identify. It just says sophisticated vocabulary. So the general rule I use with my students is, if you use a word normally, say for instance big, you need to change that to a synonym of it. So a word that's something slightly different but means the exact same thing. So in the case of big, you could use ginormous or something like that. The key thing here is not using words that you use in your everyday language. And this is the first reason why this question doesn't assess how well of a writer you are, because good writing isn't complicated. So this is the first rule you have to break of good writing. The easiest way to get into the habit of using these sophisticated pieces of language is going to a piece of work that you've already done, taking words that you've used once, twice, or more, and finding synonyms for them, and then getting into the habits of using them in your work. This is the easiest and most time-efficient manner to do it in. The next thing that the examiners are looking for is to use an interesting structure. Now, this is done in 3 primary ways. The first and most simplistic is varying sentence lengths. So you obviously have your short sentences. These are correctly identified as simple sentences. These are just 3 or 4 words that say a point very, very clearly. For instance, there was a cat. It's extremely boring, but in the right place, it can be very effective. So You can use it for the purpose of creating suspense or creating impact. They're the two main reasons why you would use a very short sentence. And the second thing is longer compound sentences. These are what you're going to be primarily writing in. So they're the ones that consist of a connective somewhere in between, or maybe even two. And these are what are going to give you the majority of the information that you'll be given to the examiner. The next way you can be using an interesting structure is with different paragraph lengths. This is also a pretty easy thing to do. We can use longer paragraph lengths, and then we can use very short ones for the same reason we would use a short sentence, to make something stand out, to make it impactful and clear. And finally, another big way in which we can use complex structure is by utilizing a cyclical structure. This at first seems hard to do. How can we start and end a description in the exact same place? Well, you do exactly that. You start at one place, overall viewpoint of the scene you're going to depict, and you zoom in and you almost follow a circular trail around that scene, and then when you're about to finish, you end up back in the exact same viewing point. This way, you ensure that you have a complex structure that you'll definitely be marked higher on. The other thing that we definitely need to do is use linguistic devices. Now, the easiest ones to use are similes and metaphors. I'm not going to go through them because they're rather simplistic. So we need to make sure we're getting in at least 4 to 6 per paragraph. This ensures that we're going to fulfill the mark scheme criteria of requiring complex linguistic ideas. So overall, they're the key things that you need to bear in mind when you're actually writing your question. Now, one thing I will say here is planning will be very, very important. And the way in which I typically get my students to plan is to take our one big fundamental idea, that's the one that will be given to you within the question, and draw a mind map based upon that and connect all the different things that could basically be a part of that scene. And then off of that, draw the 5 senses, or label the 5 senses as ideas, and use them to create microscopic trivial details within the description. And at the end of this, you should have maybe 5 or 6 slightly smaller ideas, which will give you around 30 ideas to potentially talk about, which is definitely enough because you're looking at roughly 4 to 6 pages for a top mark answer on this question. So in terms of structuring your answer, the only wrong way to structure your answer is to not use a cyclical structure. There's many ways in which you can use a cyclical structure, but the easiest way that I like to use, and all of my students seem to like, is to start zoomed out, like a landscape of London, like you're viewing it from a far distance, and then zoom in. Go on to each individual detail. Now, in terms of structuring your answer, there is a wrong way to structure it, and that's not using a cyclical structure. However, within that detail of the cyclical structure, there isn't a right way. Any way works. The way in which my students and I tend to structure it will be to start with a zoomed out focus on the scene that you're describing. So if the prompt is to describe a beautiful place as it was a few years ago, you could pick a mountain because that would be simplistic to describe and you wouldn't have to think too hard about all the different features that you could potentially talk about. So start with the overall landscape of the mountain. What are all the peaks surrounding it? And then zoom in. When you zoom in, you need to focus on the minutiae of what you're talking about. So focus upon the really individual things within the scene. You need to make sure that the examiner reading it could almost feel or touch or definitely see what you're talking about. The key thing here is imagery, and you need to make sure you are utilizing it. You need to work back from the image you want to create and allow the examiner to see that. That's the best way you're going to get a good piece of work done. So overall, you want to create a descriptive journey as such. It doesn't have to be a long, complex journey. It's not about the journey. It's not a narrative. But the journey does help you follow a predetermined path that stops you getting lost. So in summary, what you have to remember is that this question doesn't assess how good of a writer you are. It assesses how well you can follow the mark scheme. So my best piece of advice to you would be to go and have a look at the mark scheme in detail. I gave you a preliminary view of all the important points, but you could benefit from looking at it yourself to truly understand it. And the next thing is to make sure you do 2 things in your revision. create some sample descriptions of things that are likely to come up. And them things are likely to come up are things like trees, the sky, the sea. They're very broad in their application, and that way you can go into the exam and you'll have some predefined descriptions that you simply have to adapt slightly. You won't have to think about all the linguistic devices you need to include because they'll already be there, and all you have to do is remember a few key prompts that will help you remember them. That's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do in your revision is to make sure you take a piece that you've already written and find the synonyms for words that you use often. This is going to be one of the easiest ways you can boost your marks by 15, maybe even 20%, because you need to use sophisticated vocabulary. That is one of the main things on the mark scheme. It's in both AO5 and AO6, so it's really, really important. And the final thing to bear in mind is the AO6 portion of the mark scheme. You need to make sure your SPAG is perfect. So your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. It doesn't need to be that complex. I would say include some exclamation marks, include semicolons, things like that. But the punctuation doesn't need to be extremely complex. It just needs to be slightly more sophisticated than what you would normally use in your writing. And the other thing is spelling. It has to be spot on. You can't make basic spelling mistakes or you will be marked down on it. So that's the other really key important thing to remember when learning the synonyms, is you'll know how to spell them, which means you'll stop being marked down, because that's one of the ways in which the examiners will mark you down for. Even if it's somewhat legible what you've written, if it's far enough off that they had to work it out, you will not get the mark for that word. And that's something we really need to avoid, because all marks here are obviously very precious. So that's everything you need to know for this question, and well, I hope that helped.